Judge Charles Whitmore adjusted his glasses and glanced over the courtroom, his gaze briefly settling on the list of cases for the day. It was a Tuesday, and the courthouse was filled with the usual hum. Attorneys shuffling papers, a few spectators waiting their turn, and the faint sound of footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Judge Whitmore had been serving as a district judge for nearly 2 decades, and the daily grind had become second nature to him. He prided himself on being efficient and fair. The law, in his eyes, was clear, and it was his job to enforce it without exception. He opened the proceedings with the sound of his gavel, the echo sharp in the silence. The first case of the day was an assault charge, followed by a few traffic violations. Nothing that required deep reflection, just a routine of quick judgments, fines, probation, and community service. But then came the next case. Valerie Owens, the bailiff called out, his voice cutting through the air. The name didn't register immediately. Whitmore looked up to see a woman step forward from the crowd. Valerie was in her 30s, her face calm but with an intensity in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. She wore a simple professional outfit, but her presence seemed to demand attention. She was tall, with natural curls pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she walked with a certain assuredness that immediately drew Whitmore's attention. She was accused of disrupting public order during a protest in the city, where tensions had flared over a recent political issue. The charge itself wasn't particularly severe, and Whitmore had seen similar cases countless times. People protesting, pushing the boundaries of civil disobedience, only to be caught up in the system for minor infractions. They usually didn't amount to much, just fines and warnings to keep their actions within the lines. Ms. Owens, you've been charged with participating in a protest that escalated beyond the bounds of lawful demonstration. How do you plead? Whitmore asked, his tone neutral but firm. I plead not guilty, Your Honor, Valerie replied without hesitation, her voice steady but not aggressive. Not guilty, Whitmore echoed, scribbling a note on his pad. I see. Ms. Owens, while I understand the right to protest, there are legal limits to how far one can go in expressing their views. Your actions led to a disruption of public order, and there are consequences for that. Valerie didn't flinch, nor did she argue back. She simply nodded. Whitmore had seen this demeanor before, a kind of quiet defiance. Many defendants, especially younger people, reacted with anger or frustration. Not Valerie. She seemed to accept whatever came next with a calm that unsettled him, even though he couldn't quite understand why. After a brief pause, Whitmore continued, Given the nature of the charges and your previous record, I am imposing a fine of $500. You are free to go after making payment. Valerie's expression didn't change as she turned and left the courtroom, her footsteps soft on the hard floor. Judge Whitmore watched her walk out the door, a flicker of curiosity gnawing at him. There was something about her, something more than just the case at hand, that made him wonder if he had missed something important. He shook the thought away. It was just another case after all. But as he prepared to move on to the next case, a seed of doubt was planted. Something told him he hadn't seen the whole picture yet. Later that afternoon, as Whitmore sat in his office, the case with Valerie Owens lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. He had simply followed the law, as he always did. But something about the woman's presence, her calm demeanor, made him uneasy. It wasn't often that a defendant left his courtroom without a single word of protest, without so much as a glance of resentment. Most people at least tried to defend themselves, offer some excuse or justification. But Valerie had just accepted it. No anger, no defiance, just quiet resignation. Shaking his head, Whitmore dismissed the thought and focused on his paperwork. But as he scanned through the pile of legal briefs on his desk, a news alert flashed on his screen, catching his attention. Activist exposes corruption in local government. Whistleblower's battle gains national attention. Curious, Whitmore clicked the link. A photo of Valerie Owens filled the screen, taken at a press conference, surrounded by reporters. Her expression was fierce now, eyes blazing with determination. The headline continued, Valerie Owens, an activist and whistleblower, has emerged as one of the key figures in exposing corruption within local government agencies, leading to a groundbreaking case that could change the way government ethics are handled nationwide. Whitmore leaned forward, intrigued. This was the same woman, the one he had found just hours ago. The woman who had been so composed in his courtroom had now become a national figure. The article went on to explain how Valerie had been part of an investigative team that uncovered a series of unethical practices within a prominent local agency. She had worked tirelessly to expose the truth, despite facing threats and intimidation. The legal case that had followed, which she was deeply involved in, had become a landmark fight for transparency, one that could set new precedents for holding public officials accountable. A twinge of guilt flickered through Whitmore. How had he not known who she was? How had he missed the significance of her presence in his courtroom? He had treated her like just another protester, a minor disruption in the grand scheme of the court's proceedings. But now, reading about her accomplishments, he felt a rising sense of responsibility. How many others had he written off in similar ways, assuming they were simply troublemakers without knowing their true impact? For the rest of the day, Whitmore couldn't shake the thought of Valerie Owens. He reread the article, dug deeper into her past, and even watched a few interviews online. The more he learned about her work, the more he realized how wrong his initial impression had been. Valerie was no ordinary activist. She was a force for change, and the legal case she was involved in could alter the trajectory of government accountability for years to come. He sat back in his chair, a sense of unease settling over him. How could he have judged her so quickly? And why had he not taken a moment to understand her before handing down that fine? The question lingered in his mind, unanswered but demanding attention. He was beginning to realize that his courtroom had seen more than just a protester that day. It had seen a woman who was quietly changing the world. The next morning, Whitmore found himself still thinking about Valerie Owens. The headlines, the interviews, the images of her standing tall among the reporters, they all played in his mind like a loop he couldn't stop. He had spent his career dispensing judgments without much thought about the lives behind the cases, but something about Valerie was different. He had assumed she was just another protester, someone trying to stir up trouble. But the more he read, the more he understood how wrong he was. Valerie's work in uncovering corruption within a local government agency was nothing short of heroic. She wasn't just a vocal critic. She had risked everything to bring light to a system that was failing the people it was supposed to protect. Whitmore learned that she had spent months collecting evidence, speaking to whistleblowers, and working with journalists to document illegal practices. Her efforts had sparked a massive investigation, one that was now under scrutiny at the highest levels of government. Her case wasn't just about a protest. It was about the integrity of public office and the ethical responsibility of those in power. The legal battle she had become embroiled in had gained national attention. People who had once been unaware of the corruption in the local government were now watching closely as the case unfolded, and Valerie was leading the charge for transparency. Whitmore sat back in his chair, stunned by the weight of the information. He had simply slapped a fine on a woman who had been tirelessly working to change the very system he had sworn to uphold. It was like a punch to the gut. How had he not seen this? How had he not recognized the significance of her presence in his courtroom? His fingers hovered over his keyboard, but for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to search for more. He was ashamed. Ashamed that he had been so quick to judge, so blinded by his own assumptions that he couldn't see the bigger picture. He had dismissed Valerie as just another protester, a face in the crowd, someone who didn't deserve his attention. But she wasn't just a face in the crowd. She was leading a movement, and he had failed to recognize her for what she truly was. He pulled up the article again, reading the details of her work with a new sense of respect. Valerie had been relentless, taking on a system that had sought to silence her at every turn. Her activism wasn't about seeking fame or notoriety. It was about righting the wrongs of a corrupt system. She was fighting for something greater than herself, something that could ultimately benefit not just her community, but the nation. Whitmore closed his laptop slowly, his thoughts swirling. He had been wrong, so profoundly wrong. And now, the weight of that mistake pressed heavily on him. He had to do something about it. He couldn't just move on from this, not now that he understood the truth. But what could he do? How could he fix the misstep he'd made? One thing was clear. He couldn't ignore the fact that Valerie Owens had far more power to change the world than he had ever realized. And that, he knew, meant something was about to change for him too. Whitmore couldn't stop replaying the image of Valerie Owens in his mind. The determined, passionate activist he had written off in his courtroom as just another troublemaker. The realization that he had failed to see the bigger picture weighed heavily on him. What had seemed like a routine case had turned into something far more complicated, something far more important than he had initially understood. But as the days passed, his self-reflection only deepened. He began to ask himself questions he had never dared to ask before. How many other people had he dismissed in the same way, simply because they didn't fit into the neat categories he was used to? How many others had he overlooked, assuming they were just small disruptions in the system, when in reality they were trying to challenge the system itself? The truth was uncomfortable, and for the first time in his career, Whitmore felt the weight of his own biases. The harsh judgments he had handed down so routinely now felt like a series of small, unchecked wrongs. The realization gnawed at him. He had prided himself on being fair, on making decisions based purely on the facts before him. But in Valerie's case, he hadn't allowed himself to dig deeper. He hadn't bothered to ask why she had been protesting, why she was so determined to expose the corruption that had been festering in the local government. He had simply assumed she was another angry activist, intent on stirring up trouble. In doing so, he had missed the person she truly was, the woman who had been risking everything to expose injustice. His thoughts turned inward. As a judge, his role was to interpret the law fairly, without bias. But had he been doing that? Or had his own assumptions colored his decisions without him even realizing it? Valerie's case was a stark reminder that justice wasn't just about laws and rules. It was about understanding the context, the deeper story behind the facts. She wasn't just a protester. She was someone who had put herself in the line of fire to make a difference. And he had reduced her to a statistic in his courtroom, a name on a list. The more he thought about it, the more ashamed he became. He had always prided himself on being a fair and objective judge. But now he was beginning to see that fairness wasn't just about applying the law. It was about seeing people for who they were. And in this case, he had failed. Whitmore stood up and walked to the window of his office. The city skyline stretched out before him, a sea of buildings and streets bustling with life. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the usual sense of detachment. The world outside seemed different now, more alive, more complex. And in that moment, he knew he had to do something about the blind spots in his own understanding, starting with Valerie Owens. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to make amends. The question was, how could he make it right? Could he change the way he saw the world and the way he made his decisions? And more importantly, could he somehow make things right with Valerie, someone whose life and work he had so carelessly dismissed? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain: this wasn't something he could simply ignore. Not anymore. The following week, Judge Whitmore found himself wrestling with his own conscience more than ever before. His office was quiet as he sat at his desk, his mind far from the legal briefs in front of him. Valerie Owens' name had come up in the news again, this time with a more in-depth profile of her journey as a whistleblower and activist. The stories of her relentless pursuit of justice, despite the personal risks, stirred something inside him. She wasn't just another name in his courtroom. She was a person with a mission, a person who had sacrificed so much for a cause he hadn't fully understood until now. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just move on and pretend like nothing had happened. There was more at stake here than just a courtroom decision. There was a fundamental issue of fairness, respect, and the pursuit of justice that went beyond the law he so strictly adhered to. He realized he needed to speak with Valerie, not only to apologize for the fine he'd imposed without fully understanding her, but also to listen, to hear her side of the story, to understand the depth of her commitment to the cause she had so courageously championed. Whitmore hesitated for a moment, uncertain of how to approach her. He had the power to change the course of her case by offering an apology in public, but that felt too impersonal. No, this required more. It required a conversation, an honest one, face to face. He found her contact information online, and after a few moments of doubt, he picked up the phone. The line rang twice before it was answered. "Hello." Valerie's voice was warm, but guarded. "Ms. Owens, this is Judge Charles Whitmore." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'd like to meet with you. In person. If that's all right with you." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Valerie's voice came through, steady yet cautious. "What's this about, Your Honor?" "I owe you an apology," Whitmore said, his voice sincere. I judged you far too quickly, and I'd like the chance to explain myself, if you'd be willing to meet." There was another pause, longer this time, and Whitmore could feel his heart racing. He wasn't sure if she would accept. After all, he had been part of the system she was fighting against. He had failed her. But after a few moments, Valerie spoke again. "I'm not sure what you could possibly say, Judge Whitmore, but if you want to meet, we can. I'm free tomorrow afternoon." Whitmore felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about him trying to clear his conscience. This was about something far bigger. Valerie wasn't just a person he had wronged. She was part of a movement that was pushing for the kind of change he himself had never fully realized was necessary. They agreed to meet at a cafe downtown, and as Whitmore hung up the phone, a sense of anticipation settled over him. He didn't know what to expect from their conversation, but he knew one thing. It was time for him to listen. Truly listen. It was time to hear the story he had missed. The next afternoon, Whitmore arrived early at the small cafe Valerie had chosen. It was a quiet place, tucked away on a side street, where the hum of the city seemed distant, almost irrelevant. He sat at a table near the window, nervously drumming his fingers on the surface. His palms were damp, his thoughts racing. This was no ordinary conversation. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew that this moment could be pivotal, both for him and for Valerie. When Valerie walked in, Whitmore stood up. She was dressed casually, but there was something about her that commanded attention. She was the same woman he had seen in the courtroom just days earlier, but now she looked different, more real, more human. She was no longer just a name on a docket or a headline in the news. She was someone with depth, with a mission, and with a quiet power that seemed to fill the space around her. "Ms. Owens," Whitmore said, offering the nervous smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Valerie nodded but didn't offer a handshake. She took a seat across from him, her eyes watchful, calculating. "Let's hear it, Judge. What's this about?" Whitmore cleared his throat. "I made a mistake, and I need to own it. When I saw you in my courtroom, I didn't take the time to understand who you were. I dismissed you as just another protester. But you aren't just a protester. You're someone fighting for justice, for transparency, and I was wrong to judge you the way I did." Valerie listened quietly, her face unreadable. There was no anger in her eyes, but there wasn't forgiveness either. It was as if she were waiting, not just for an apology, but for something more, an acknowledgement of the larger issue at hand. Whitmore took a deep breath. "I've spent my career assuming that the law alone was enough to deliver justice, but the more I've learned about you and your work, the more I realize that there's more to justice than just the application of rules. Your fight for transparency, for ethical conduct in government, those aren't just ideals. They're critical to the health of this country. And I, of all people, should have recognized that." Valerie's gaze softened just a fraction, but she didn't interrupt. Whitmore continued, his words flowing more easily now that he had begun to speak the truth. I thought I was being fair, but fairness isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding the people in front of you, seeing the bigger picture, and acknowledging the complexities of their actions." Valerie leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, as if processing his words. The silence stretched on, but Whitmore didn't break it. He knew this wasn't a simple apology. He had to show her, not just tell her, that he had learned something deeper about justice than what he'd been taught in law school or his years on the bench. Finally, Valerie spoke, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "So, what now? What do you plan to do with this newfound understanding?" Whitmore's heart pounded in his chest. "I want to support your case. I don't know how yet, but I need to make it right. If you'll allow me, I want to use my platform to amplify your voice." Valerie studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "You're not the first person to misjudge me, Judge, but you're the first to try to make it right." The conversation had shifted. It wasn't just about his mistake anymore. It was about the future. And in that moment, Whitmore realized that this was more than just an apology. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change the way he viewed his role in the world of law. Over the next few weeks, Whitmore's decision to reach out to Valerie began to ripple through both their lives in unexpected ways. The conversation at the cafe had been a turning point for both of them, but neither of them fully understood how deep its effects would go. For Valerie, it wasn't just about receiving an apology from a judge who had wronged her. It was about seeing the potential for change in a system she had spent years fighting against. Whitmore had been a symbol of that system, someone who represented the authority that, in her eyes, had too often worked to stifle justice. But now, he was beginning to question the very system he had once upheld without question. That realization gave her a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the legal system wasn't entirely beyond repair. For Whitmore, Valerie's willingness to listen, despite his previous dismissal, was eye-opening. He had been so certain of his role as a judge, so entrenched in his belief that the law alone could deliver justice, that he had failed to see the humanity behind it. But meeting Valerie had forced him to reckon with his own shortcomings, and as he began to follow her case more closely, he found himself questioning the very fabric of the justice system he had spent his life defending. Whitmore began to speak out about the issues that Valerie had spent years working to expose. He publicly acknowledged that the system, despite its strengths, had blind spots, places where justice could be manipulated, where power could be abused. For the first time in his career, he didn't shy away from discussing the flaws of the legal world. He started attending community meetings and speaking at events, calling for transparency in government and advocating for reform. He used his platform to elevate voices like Valerie's, those who were pushing for accountability and ethical conduct, regardless of the political cost. The impact of his words was immediate. Local newspapers picked up on his shift in perspective. Columnists praised him for his newfound openness and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Lawyers and activists who had once viewed him with skepticism began reaching out, wanting to work alongside him for meaningful reform. Whitmore's reputation began to evolve from that of a stoic, traditional judge to a thought leader who recognized that change was not just possible, it was necessary. For Valerie, the support from a high-ranking figure like Whitmore was a powerful boost to her cause. His public acknowledgement of her work not only brought more attention to her case, but also inspired others to get involved in the movement for governmental reform. The legal battle she had been fighting for so long now had a new momentum, as Whitmore's endorsement lent her credibility and respectability in the eyes of people who might otherwise have dismissed her as just another activist. Together, they began to shift the narrative surrounding both Valerie's case and the broader conversation about ethics in government. No longer was it just a lone woman fighting an uphill battle. It was a growing coalition of individuals, including Whitmore, willing to confront the issues that had long been ignored. The story had evolved from a simple courtroom encounter to a powerful dialogue about justice, fairness, and the need for change. And for Whitmore, the journey was only just beginning. The man who had once felt so sure of his judgments was now learning, day by day, that true justice didn't always come from the law. It came from a willingness to listen, to learn, and to adapt. Months passed since Whitmore's pivotal meeting with Valerie Owens, and both their lives had changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. For Whitmore, the transformation had been profound. He had started to view his position on the bench not just as an enforcer of the law, but as a steward of a larger moral responsibility. A responsibility to ensure that justice wasn't only about rules, but also about fairness, compassion, and integrity. Valerie had opened his eyes to the human element that the law often overlooked, and now he couldn't unsee it. He had become an advocate for systemic reform, publicly supporting efforts to increase transparency within local government and calling for greater accountability among public officials. His stance had stirred some controversy. Many of his colleagues in the legal community were reluctant to challenge the status quo. Some viewed him as compromising his objectivity, while others praised him for taking a bold stand. But to Whitmore, it was no longer about playing it safe. It was about doing what was right. Valerie, for her part, was thriving in a way she hadn't imagined. The media coverage of her efforts had surged, and with Whitmore's support, her case gained national attention. Her legal battle against government corruption had become a symbol of resistance, and she had inspired a new generation of activists and whistleblowers. What began as a small, solitary fight had transformed into a movement, a force for ethical reform that had gained momentum far beyond what Valerie could have ever hoped for. But the most important change wasn't just in their professional lives. It was in their personal connection. Whitmore and Valerie continued to meet, not just for public discussions or to strategize, but to share their thoughts on justice, life, and the nature of change. What had started as a meeting filled with tension and uncertainty had blossomed into a partnership based on mutual respect and a shared vision for a better future. They didn't always agree on every detail, but their conversations were a constant reminder of how much they had to learn from each other. One day, as they sat in a quiet park after a long discussion about upcoming legislative reforms, Valerie turned to Whitmore. "You know, I never imagined this," she said, a hint of a smile on her face. "That we'd be sitting here, working together like this." Whitmore chuckled. "Neither did I. But sometimes, the most important changes happen when you least expect them. I never realized how much I had to learn. About the law, about the people it affects, and about myself. I think that's the real work, isn't it?" Valerie said thoughtfully. "Not just changing the system, but changing the way we think about it. About justice, fairness, and who gets to define it." Whitmore nodded. "Exactly. The law can only take us so far. It's up to people like you, and people like me, who are willing to listen and adapt, to push it farther." Their conversation stretched on into the evening, but there was no urgency, no rush. For both of them, this was just the beginning of a long and uncertain journey. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, but they knew one thing for sure. Together, they could make a difference. And with each step, they were reshaping not only the legal system, but also the future they wanted to create. A future where justice meant more than just enforcing laws, but understanding the people behind them. As they parted ways that evening, Whitmore felt a sense of peace he had never known in his career. He had started out as a judge in a courtroom, but now he was something more, a student of justice, forever learning, forever changing. And as long as Valerie was by his side, he knew that path would always lead to progress.